Thank you, everyone. Be water, my friends. My master would have said, Bruce Lee, he shall on. So thank you. I'm here to speak on high flow oxygen therapy. It's a technology that many of us counted on during the pandemic. And here you see, thanks to David Wilm, I borrowed a simple setup of high flow therapy. Many of us call this the fish on the stick because of the humidifier, or some of us call it a pig on a stick. And the high flow devices that are in use today are very, very integrated. They coordinate flows to heating, and they attempt to reduce condensate. This is my disclosures. I run a clinical research organization, and I've done fluidics devices for mechanical ventilation. I work with Air on their FDA submission. Air is a respiratory company out of Irvine, California. And of course, I was the founder of Event Medical, which made about 5 or 6 ventilators. I work with Oxford University, Wadham College, and transferring technology out of Oxford. And we're working on a ventilator injury lung monitor. Again, I am a respiratory therapist by training, 4 years of physiology on top of that, and I've spent a lot of time focused on regulatory issues because I wanted to bring products to market. These are the objectives. I won't spend too much time on them. Introduction to high flow oxygen therapy, definitions, indications for use. You will find that I will use regulatory terms in describing things. It's just in my nature. I want to emphasize something that I always am impressed with Ross Fraburn emphasizing, which is the difference between ventilation and oxygenation. You'd be surprised how many clinicians I meet that don't understand what the drivers are for those two things, don't separate those two things. And I think in some ways that's why we went down the path of ventilator-induced lung injury. We thought we were happy. We had oximetry, come of age in the 90s, and we thought we knew what we were doing. We really still have a lot of learning. The current recommendations from the societies I'm going to go through, and then I want to talk about matching flow to the inspiratory drive. Patients with hypoxic respiratory failure have high inspiratory drives, and with most of the devices capped at 60 liters per minute out in the field, I know that we've heard stories during the pandemic of people daisy chaining multiple units together to reach higher flows. I also am going to talk a little bit about humidity and then get some questions and answers from the team. So this is all basic stuff. You guys, I know everyone here understands that. There's no need really to go in detail here, but clearly supplemental oxygen saves lives. Whether or not we know what it does, Ross, the heart or the lungs, when they fail, we provide supplemental oxygen. When supplemental oxygen fails, we usually look at putting patients into the ICU. There's a high level of mortality if we commit them to mechanical ventilation, 30 to 50%, depending on which literature you read. And we know that it's not very good for the hospitals. They have to spend a lot of money. The intensive care unit is an area of highest expenditure within acute care hospitals, and it's certainly not good for the patients. So in 2015, this article really set the stage and set a foundation for the use of high flow oxygen. This was Fratz Study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and 310 patients. Actually, out of 1,000, they ended up randomizing to 310 patients. And what they found was that at a survival rate at 90 days was much higher in the high flow nasal cannula patients than in the conventional oxygen therapy and also in the NIV patients. And that the high flow patients presented with 12 deaths, the conventional oxygen therapy patients 18, and non-invasive, who actually also were put on high flow in between their bouts of NIV, also presented with a higher rate of death. The ventilator-free days at day 28 were significantly higher in the high flow group as compared to the conventional oxygen group and the NIV group. And I believe that this study essentially proclaimed high flow nasal cannula as a preferred therapy for patients with hypoxemic respiratory failure. One of my favorite articles, though, is an article by Matthew Drake that goes through a lot of the foundations of how high flow works. We know that the benefits of high flow are that we see improved oxygenation, that there's a decrease in anatomic dead space due to washing out of that dead space, that because of that washout and some of the effects on respiratory rate and oxygenation, there's a decrease in the metabolic cost of breathing, reduced carbon dioxide generation. Generally speaking, we know there's a rule of thumb, and the speaker after me, Dr. Nick Hill, will also, he has taught me that there is a rule of thumb for every 10 liters per minute. We tend to see about a centimeter of water in a closed mouth breathing patient. Open mouth flows of 60, we're looking at 6 hectopascal or centimeters of water with closed mouth and about 3 with open mouth. And of course, that's rule of thumb. That has to do with the breathing rate and the expiratory compliance or elastance of the patient. And the reconditioning of inspired gas also is important. We're putting high flows through. Those high flows that are adequately humidified can result in improved patient compliance, also have been associated with improved mucociliary clearance, or at least the maintenance or homeostasis of mucociliary clearance. As many of you know, medical air, medical gas is dry. It requires the addition of humidification, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Again, superior comfort and reduced room air entrainment. I'm going to talk more about the reduced room air entrainment with high flow. I think that's important, especially when we're using indices like PaO2 over FiO2 or the ROX index. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I will say that if you look at the FDA, the MOD or the total product life cycle area, you're going to find that the indication, which is different than the intended use, the indication is to augment the breathing of spontaneously breathing patients suffering from respiratory distress or hypoxemia. So they've certainly recognized that it's respiratory distress or hypoxemia. I would say clinically, though, we're using high flow to treat hypoxemic respiratory failure where conventional oxygen therapy is failing. That's, I think, a simpler indication. And an intended use is the functional use of a product or a tool or a therapy. And again, the FDA would say that the intended use, the function of high flow, is to add moisture and warm gases to administer a higher level of oxygenation to the patient. And again, what we would probably say as clinicians is that it's intended to provide higher inspiratory flows of precise oxygen concentration. Now, notice I'm using the word oxygen concentration. I'm not using the word FiO2. We've gotten lazy in our devices by labeling things FiO2. In reality, they're not FiO2, they're oxygen concentration. Clearly, in a closed system, you could say that they're that those are FiO2. But once we go to non-invasive ventilation, unless we're matching the flows, they really are not. So we had a nice discussion on Ventilation Matters, a great podcast that Ross talked a lot about the use of high flow during the pandemic. I'd recommend that you take a look at that, and we'll get you the links to that. So I'm not going to talk about recruitment. I'm not going to talk about PEEP, although we should think of PEEP in the way that it affects mean airway pressure. So keeping things simple, we should always think that the drivers of oxygenation are oxygen concentration and mean airway pressure. Very, very different from the drivers of CO2 removal and ventilation. And we know from work done by David Dansker and a lot of UCSD physicians and West Physiology that CO2 removal, the drivers for that come from convection and more specifically tidal volume movement, the piston being the lung, the diaphragm moving in a convective way, CO2 out of the lung. And it's important that we also understand when we're thinking of high flow that the issues and the equations of basic work. Now we know the simple equation of work is force times distance. In respiratory, we're thinking of force being hectopascal or centimeters of water, basically pressure, and we're thinking of distance as tidal volume. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. We also should realize that that's just work, and when we apply frequency, that turns it into work rate. And you know, I'm not going to get into power equations. That's not the purpose of this talk, but it is high flow. So oxygenation drivers are the point of oxygenation. My pet peeve, again, I already mentioned this. I couldn't wait for my slide. I had to jump ahead and tell everyone that oxygen concentration is not FiO2. In non-invasive modes, for oxygen concentration to equal FiO2, the device operator has to have a reasonable assessment of the patient's inspiratory demand, and I would suggest that the flow set on the device exceed the patient's demand in order for FiO2 to be equal to oxygen concentration. And Brochard has talked a lot about that as well. If peak flow is not exceeded, of course, we know there's room air entrained and it dilutes the FiO2. Again, if we're using indices like the PaO2 over FiO2 and we are not matching the inspiratory demand, guess what? We are probably more aggressive in thinking the patient is worse off than they are. You know, I'm going to use some simple numbers, but if we have a PaO2 of 100 and we have an FiO2 of 1, we're looking at 100, right? But in reality, if we haven't matched that inspiratory demand and the real FiO2 is 80%, then they're probably doing better. They probably have a 125 ratio. Same thing with the ROX index. So I just caution us to make sure that we have the benefits of high flow. And as you know, devices today are a little bit lower in their application of flow, and it's very important that we apply flow and consider the risks as well as the complications of that flow application. I've already covered the drivers of oxygenation. It's O2 concentration, mean airway pressure in a simple way. Of course, PEEP and recruitment is involved there as well. So I wrote a paper and it was published in the Journal of Mechanical Ventilation, where I looked at the risks associated with higher flows being applied to patients. Clearly, there are complications as well, things like patient discomfort at higher flows. But I would tell you that patients' discomfort over time can be alleviated, and that discomfort is not a risk to the patient. A true risk to the patient could be considered a delay in intubation when a patient might be failing. But of course, I mentioned earlier, with higher flows, at least we as clinicians, can leave the unit, give the care staff behind some guidance, including clinical assessment, watching the respiratory rate, or, nasal flaring, accessory muscles, etc. Another concern that we've heard from some clinicians is work of breathing. We've also heard it from regulators that, high flow, adds a work of breathing to the patient. And I would tend to disagree. I think the literature shows opposite. And of course, some other risks in higher flows are the application of humidity therapy. It's important that we realize at higher flows, also the water chambers, the places where we keep the water, will be consumed at a higher rate, and we should have devices that are capable of quickly alarming when those water chambers are eliminated or are empty in water. In the other consideration, just like NIV, is that these higher flows will lead to higher pressures. Those higher pressures would exceed the esophageal opening pressure, and that excess might lead to gastric insufflation, aspiration, etc. So in order to demonstrate that higher flows were not going to generate higher pressures, or at least pressures that exceeded the 20 centimeter level of esophageal opening pressure, I created a anatomical model using the PF300 and a TTL system, used a ventilator to drive a spontaneous breathing model, and looked at the effects of pressure on the intraoral space. Did it in 4 models, did it in active breathing, did it in passive breathing, created a lung collapse model, and also used an open mouth methodology. In doing that, we were able to see that the highest pressure generated at 80 liters per minute was 6 centimeters of water, and that was when the patient was actively breathing against the incoming flow of 80 liters per minute. And again, this was far below the worry of 20 centimeters of water to open the esophagus. Now, I'm not saying that patients don't have this risk, but the pressure levels are significantly less. Patrick Tan, who isn't here today, but out of Malaysia, had asked me, what about the mouth breathers? What about the gulpers? And certainly the big gulpers are going to still continue to have that risk, probably whether we're delivering 5 centimeters of water or 3 centimeters of water. So again, the risks of higher flows are desiccated secretions. That comes from not providing sufficient humidity. A greater consumption of water may result in exhaustion, so we have to have good alarm systems. Flows that are associated with higher airway pressures, they do generate higher airway pressures, but far below the gastric insufflation level, and we didn't find that there was any increased risk of aspiration. The humidity standards that we should be aware of as clinicians are defined by the ISO, the International Standards Organization, and for non-invasive patients, we should be delivering 12 milligrams per liter of humidity. That's because we do not bypass the upper airway, and the upper airway still participates. We are used to delivering 33 milligrams per liter to the ventilator. That's, again, the standard of care that we'll see on something like an MR850 or other humidifiers. And there is a call in the literature lately. I think it's Professor Lelouch for higher levels of humidity that are closer to the 30 milligrams per liter in non-invasive ventilation. Condensate is an important element, mostly in intubated patients or trach patients, probably not as big of an issue in a non-invasive patient. And When we look at then the growth of high flow, we see it now being used in a number of ways. If you look at the American Thoracic Society, the European Respiratory Society, or the Society of Critical Care Medicine, we see that high flow is grown in its application. It has strong recommendations, of course, dating back to the Fratz article for hypoxemic respiratory failure. We see in the operating room in particular with patients who have high risk, but even in the ICU, post-extubation, the use of high flow growing in that area. Post-operatively, also patients who have smoking history or are obese or have cardiac problems, we see high flow growing in application in those areas. And another interesting application that we should be monitoring in the literature is peri-intubation. We know that the CPR guidance documents now require that we pay attention to the adequacy of cardiac compression, and certainly the application of high flow allows the first responders to do that. In summary, high flow is an accepted therapy in the treatment of hypoxemic patients. There's lots of clinical applications throughout the continuum of care, and I think that we'll continue, like any new tool or relatively new tool, we'll continue to see new applications, and we should be guarded in some ways, but also be open to the application in places where we clearly understand what the device is doing. So that's it. Thank you for your time. Any questions about high flow, or as Ehab mentioned earlier, any questions about the martial arts are welcomed, or any questions about mechanical ventilators. I am going to go back to Ron Anderson's question about, even if you put your ventilator at 0 PEEP, it's not going to be at 0 PEEP. We need a level of PEEP to recognize triggering. We need a level of PEEP and a level of flow to overcome the resistance of the circuits. So even when you set 0, manufacturers of ventilators are setting a little bit above that, at least 2 or 3 centimeters of water. So the question was about the use in pediatric area and neonatal area of cannulas with larger diameters and their ability to transmit pressures and trigger. And I would say that we tend to learn a lot from the neonatal and pediatric care of patients. And a lot of times we realize that we've gone off course. I think another area where we could go back and look at things is the basic, I know people will yell blasphemy, but the basic application of square wave, if we knew what the right effective lung volume was and the right dead space, then we could apply the appropriate tidal volume and not necessarily worry so much. In terms of high flow, yeah, there was another part of that question was whether larger cannulas in the adult areas should be used, larger diameters. I'll tell you that, again, it goes back to the manufacturer. And if the manufacturer offers you a cannula, then they have done the testing to assure that that cannula does 2 things. One, that it's capable of delivering the appropriate flow, but secondly, that the alarms that you have in place, like disconnect or circuit occlusion, that those actually work as well. So I think it's important to have larger cannula sizes. Of course, pressure is an issue, but I think we will see smarter cannulas, and I think we'll see large bore cannulas as well. Okay, thank you. We're going to take a few minutes because we have Dr. Nick Hill waiting. We're going to convert our system to allow Dr. Hill to speak on non-invasive ventilation. So if you'll give us a few minutes, thank you.